Hey, tonight we are going to explore the forgotten resilience of medieval peasants, those unsung heroes of history who endured against impossible odds. Picture yourself walking barefoot along ancient dirt paths, where the whispers of ancestors linger in morning mist. These humble folk fashioned survival from nearly nothing, crafting remedies from wild herbs when plague swept through villages, preserving food through bitter winters when crops failed, and finding clever ways to navigate the harsh demands of feudal lords. Their stories aren't filled with knights and glory, but rather with quiet wisdom passed through generations, with calloused hands that knew both earth and heartache, with communities that held together when the very fabric of their world threatened to unravel. Tonight, we honor their peaceful perseverance. If you find comfort in these gentle historical tales, I'd be grateful if you'd like, share, and subscribe to join our growing community of nighttime listeners. It means the world to have you here with us. I'm curious, what corner of the world are you nestling into sleep from tonight? Perhaps you're tucked beneath blankets as rain patters against your window, or maybe stars are visible through your curtains. Now dim your lights, find that perfect position against your pillow, and let the gentle rhythms of medieval village life carry you toward peaceful slumber as we journey back to simpler, quieter times. In the small village of Whisper Willow, nestled between ancient forests and meandering streams, life moved with the steady rhythm of seasons. The year was 1347, though few villagers tracked time by numbers. They knew the turning of days by the position of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the gradual shift from planting to harvest. Their world was small yet complete, bound by the borders of their lord's estate and the natural landmarks that had guided their ancestors for generations. The village consisted of several dozen wattle and daub cottages with thatched roofs that needed regular mending. Smoke curled perpetually from central hearths, carrying with it the simple aromas of pottage, that ever-present stew of vegetables and occasional meat that sustained peasant families through their labor-filled days. Children, with sun-browned faces, played in the dusty village center, while hens pecked busily around their feet. Dogs lounged in patches of sunlight, alert to the comings and goings of neighbors and livestock alike. Among these humble dwellings stood the cottage of Thomas and Agnes Fletcher. Like most in Whisper Willow, they lived simply, their home a single, room shared with their 3 children. Their eldest daughter Eleanor, now 12 summers old, helped her mother with household tasks, grinding grain for bread, tending the vegetable garden that supplemented their meals, and caring for her younger siblings. Their son William, 9 years of age, was learning his father's craft of arrow making, while little Matilda, just 4, spent her days observing the world with wide, curious eyes. Dawn arrived with gentle persistence, filtering through the small, unglazed window covered with oiled parchment. Agnes stirred first, as she always did, rising from the straw mattress shared with Thomas. The earthen floor felt cool beneath her bare feet as she moved quietly about the cottage, stoking the banked fire from the previous night. The familiar motions required no thought. Her hands knew the work as intimately as they knew the texture of her wooden spoon or the weight of her clay water pitcher. Thomas awoke soon after, stretching his limbs that ached from yesterday's labor. There was comfort in routine, in knowing what each day would bring. After a simple breakfast of dark bread and ale, he would join the other villagers in the fields, while Agnes would attend to her endless tasks, spinning wool, making cheese from their goat's milk, preserving vegetables for the coming winter months. Eleanor would accompany her mother today, learning the quiet domestic wisdom passed down through generations of women. This morning, however, brought something different. News travelled swiftly from the neighbouring village of Briarwood. A travelling merchant spoke of illness in the southern towns, a sickness that moved mysteriously from person to person, leaving swollen lymph nodes and dark marks upon the skin. The elders of Whisper Willow gathered near the village well, their voices low but urgent. "My cousin in Oakfield sent word," said Walter the miller, his flour-dusted hands gesturing as he spoke. "3 families taken ill in a fortnight. They say it begins with fever, then the painful swellings appear." Margaret, the village's most respected healer and midwife, listened intently. At 67 winters, she had seen sickness before. The sweating illness, flux of the bowels, child fever. But this description awakened old memories, stories told by her grandmother of a great mortality that had once swept through distant lands. Later that morning, as Agnes collected herbs from her small garden, Margaret approached with measured steps. The older woman's face was weathered like well-loved leather, her eyes bright with intelligence despite her advancing years. "Agnes," she said softly, "I would speak with you about preparing for what may come." Agnes straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. Margaret had helped bring all 3 of her children into the world and had taught her much about healing herbs and poultices. If Margaret was concerned, there was cause to listen carefully. "What troubles you?" Agnes asked, inviting the older woman to sit upon the wooden bench beside her garden. "The illness they speak of," Margaret began, her voice steady but solemn. "It brings to mind tales from my grandmother's time. We must gather certain herbs in abundance: feverfew, yarrow, angelica root. We will prepare vinegars steeped with rosemary and lavender to cleanse the air within our homes." Margaret explained how such preparations had helped some villagers fare better than others during past sicknesses. Agnes listened attentively, mentally cataloguing the plants they would need to gather. The subtle scent of thyme and mint rose from the garden as a gentle breeze stirred the leaves, as if nature itself was reminding them of its healing gifts. "We will begin tomorrow at first light," Agnes decided. "Eleanor is old enough now to learn these ways as well." Margaret nodded, pleased. "The knowledge must pass to the young. It is how we have always survived." As Margaret departed, Agnes looked toward the fields where Thomas worked alongside other villagers. The barley was ripening well this year, a blessing after last summer's poor harvest. Perhaps they would have enough to set aside, should they need to remain close to home if sickness approached. The following days took on a different rhythm. While the men continued their work in the fields, for the crops waited for no one, plague or no plague, the women and children of Whisper Willow ventured into the surrounding woodlands and meadows with new purpose. They gathered herbs in woven baskets, their fingers stained green with plant oils and resins. Eleanor proved particularly adept at identifying the helpful plants. "This is yarrow," she would say confidently, pointing to the feathery leaves and tiny clustered flowers. "And there, Mother, the angelica with its hollow stems." Agnes smiled at her daughter's quick learning. "You have your grandmother's eye," she said softly, referring to her own mother who had passed 3 winters ago. Back in their cottage, they hung bundles of herbs from the ceiling beams to dry. The air inside grew fragrant with medicinal scents, sharp and clean, nature's own protection. Margaret had shown them how to prepare vinegar infusions in clay jars, sealed tightly and placed in sunny spots to strengthen. The vinegar draws out the virtue of the herbs, she explained to the circle of women and children gathered in her cottage. When illness approaches, sprinkle it about your homes, especially where air seems stagnant. While the village prepared its defences against disease, other concerns continued to shape daily life. The lord of the manor, Sir Geoffrey de Lacy, sent his steward to remind the villagers that the annual tax would soon be due. Each household owed a portion of their harvest, along with additional payments for use of the lord's mill and bread ovens. Thomas returned from the fields one evening, his face etched with worry lines. The steward says Sir Geoffrey expects the same measure as last year, despite the talk of illness, he told Agnes as he washed trail dust from his hands in a basin of water. And there's more. 2 additional days of labour required on the domain lands before our own harvest can be gathered. Agnes pressed her lips together but said nothing, as the children might overhear. Later, when the little ones slept in their corner of the cottage, she and Thomas spoke in hushed tones by the dying fire. If the sickness comes and we cannot work, the fields, how will we meet the Lord's demands? Thomas wondered, his calloused hands absently smoothing a piece of wood he was carving into a spoon. We will manage as we always have, Agnes replied, her nimble fingers continuing to spin wool, despite the late hour. My mother lived through 3 famines and 2 wars. Her mother survived the great storms that destroyed half the village. We endure because we must. Thomas nodded, finding comfort in his wife's quiet strength. They had weathered difficult times before, the winter 5 years past when snow had piled higher than their doorway, the summer when drought had withered their crops, the fever that had nearly taken William as an infant. The next morning, Thomas joined other men from the village to discuss how they might approach Sir Geoffrey's steward about the labour demands. Walter the miller, whose position granted him slightly more liberty to speak, offered to present their concerns. We will remind him that dead peasants pay no taxes, Walter said with grim humour. Perhaps the Lord will see reason if he understands that working us to exhaustion while sickness threatens serves no one's interests. As the men talked, filaments of mist rose from the dewy fields around them. In the distance, the Lord's manor house sat upon a gentle rise, its stone walls and timber frames solid against the softness of the landscape. Sir Geoffrey was not the worst of lords. He rarely ordered physical punishments and had once reduced taxes after a particularly devastating flood. But the gap between his life and theirs remained as vast as the difference between their sturdy boots and the peasants' wrapped cloth foot coverings. Walter's diplomatic efforts bore modest fruit. The steward returned 2 days later with word that Sir Geoffrey would accept 1 additional Labour Day rather than 2, provided the harvest met expectations. It was a small concession, but the villagers received it gratefully. He also sends this, the steward added, somewhat reluctantly, producing a small pot of salve. Lady Beatrice had it prepared by her personal physician. It contains crushed pearls and other precious substances to ward off miasmas. The Lord instructs that it be given to Margaret the healer, to be used for any who fall ill. Margaret accepted the gift with appropriate thanks, though later she confided to Agnes, "Crushed pearls may impress noble ladies, but our own remedies will serve better. Still, it was kind of Lady Beatrice to think of us." The next fortnight passed in anxious preparation. The men worked double time in the fields, aware that every sheaf of grain harvested before illness might arrive was a safeguard against future hunger. Women preserved everything that could be stored, salting cabbage, drying apples in thin slices, packing turnips in sand. Children were set to gathering nuts from the forest edge, adding to the village's winter stores. Throughout these labours, Margaret continued teaching her healing knowledge to Agnes, Eleanor, and several other women who showed aptitude. For generations, our mothers and grandmothers have known how to ease suffering. she told them as they prepared poultices of comfrey for bruises and wounds. This knowledge is our inheritance and our gift to those who will come after. One damp morning, as Thomas prepared to leave for the fields, a stranger appeared at the edge of the village. His clothes were travel-stained, his face gaunt with exhaustion. He stumbled slightly before steadying himself against the trunk of an ancient oak tree that marked the village boundary. William spotted the man first and ran to tell his father. Thomas approached cautiously, keeping some distance between himself and the traveller. "God give you good day," Thomas called. "What brings you to Whisper Willow?" The man, young, perhaps no more than 20 summers, looked up with feverish eyes. "I seek my uncle, Peter the Smith. They said in Briarwood that he settled here some years past." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Peter is here, yes. But before I take you to him, I must ask, are you well? There is talk of sickness in the southern villages." The young man shook his head. "I've travelled for days, that's all. Hunger and weariness, nothing more." Thomas studied him carefully. The stranger showed no visible swellings or dark marks that the merchant had described. Still, caution seemed wise. "Wait here," Thomas instructed. "I'll bring Peter to you, and some food as well." Peter confirmed that the young man was indeed his sister's son, John, whom he hadn't seen since the boy was small. After consultation with Margaret, the village decided to allow John to stay, but in a small hut at the village edge that had been empty since old Widow Thatcher's passing last winter. There he would remain for 7 days to ensure he carried no illness. Food and water were left for him daily, and Peter spoke with him from a safe distance. John accepted these precautions with good grace, understanding the villagers' fears. In Briarwood, he told his uncle, 3 families fell ill within days of each other. They closed their doors to all visitors, even kin. On the 4th day of John's isolation, Margaret visited him, observing his condition carefully. She carried with her a bundle of herbs and a jar of her vinegar preparation. "You show no signs of the pestilence," she confirmed, "but best to cleanse the air in your temporary home nonetheless." She instructed him on how to use the herbal preparations, adding, "These have protected our people since time beyond memory." John completed his week of isolation without developing any symptoms, and the village cautiously welcomed him. Peter took him in as an apprentice, grateful for the young man's strong arms and willingness to learn the blacksmith's craft. The harvest progressed steadily under clear autumn skies. The village breathed a collective sigh of relief as the last sheaves were gathered and bound, the barns filling with golden grain that would see them through winter. The Lord's portion was measured out carefully, delivered to his storehouse by ox-drawn carts. Then, as the first frost silvered the meadows one morning, dire news arrived. A neighbouring village just 5 miles distant reported cases of the dreaded illness. 2 families stricken, with symptoms matching the descriptions they had heard. Fever, painful swellings, dark marks spreading across the skin. The village council gathered immediately in the small wooden church. Father Benedict, their priest, opened with a prayer for protection and wisdom. Then Walter the miller, as the most educated among them, spoke. "We have prepared as best we can," he said, his usually jovial face solemn. "Now we must decide how to protect ourselves further. Some say we should close Whisper Willow to all outsiders until the danger passes." Discussion flowed back and forth. Some argued for complete isolation, no one to enter or leave the village until spring thaw. Others worried about trade. They needed salt, iron tools, and other necessities that only merchants could provide. Margaret listened to all sides before offering her thoughts. "In my grandmother's time," she said, her voice soft yet carrying, To every corner of the church, those villages that fared best did indeed limit contact with strangers, but they also practiced cleanliness beyond the usual custom. They washed their bodies more frequently, even in winter. They burned certain herbs daily in their homes, and importantly, they cared for one another. She explained how communities that abandoned their sick members fared worse than those who found ways to provide care while still protecting the healthy. If the pestilence comes to Whisper Willow, she concluded, we must remember that we are more than individuals. We are one body, as Father Benedict teaches. When one suffers, all suffer. When one receives care, all benefit. Her words resonated deeply. The council decided to limit contact with outsiders, but not ban it entirely. Merchants would be allowed to leave their goods at the village boundary for collection after they departed. Anyone showing signs of illness would be moved to 2 designated cottages at the village edge, where those who had survived similar illnesses in the past would tend to them using Margaret's methods. In the weeks that followed, these precautions were implemented with careful attention. Agnes taught Eleanor and other children how to make small sachets filled with protective herbs to hang around their necks. Thomas and other men constructed a washing area near the stream, where villagers could more easily cleanse themselves despite the cooling weather. Father Benedict, in addition to his regular prayers and services, blessed the village boundaries with holy water, walking the entire perimeter while invoking divine protection. The villagers took comfort in these spiritual defenses alongside their practical measures. As winter settled more deeply over the land, bringing short days and long nights filled with storytelling around hearth fires, Whisper Willow remained untouched by the pestilence. Reports came of other villages not so fortunate, entire families lost, fields left fallow, because no one remained to tend them. One evening, as Agnes and Thomas sat by their fire while the children slept, Agnes spoke of her fears. What if it comes despite all our preparations? What if our herbs and prayers are not enough? Thomas took her hand, his work-roughened fingers gentle against hers. Then we will face it together, as we have faced every hardship. But look, we have food stored, we have Margaret's wisdom, we have a community that stands united. Many don't have even that much. Agnes nodded, finding peace in his steady presence and practical outlook. Thomas had always been thus, not given to flights of fancy or despair, but solidly rooted in what could be done today, this hour, this moment. When January brought heavy snows, effectively isolating Whisper Willow for weeks at a time, the villagers turned inward, focusing on crafts and repairs that couldn't be addressed during busier seasons. Thomas taught William more intricate techniques of arrow making, while Agnes showed Eleanor the patterns for weaving cloth on their simple loom. Little Matilda delighted in helping her mother sort dried herbs, her small fingers surprisingly deft at separating chamomile flowers from stems. "This one smells like sunshine," she declared, holding a bloom to her nose. Agnes smiled at her daughter's observation. "Indeed it does, and it brings a bit of sunshine to those who drink it as tea when they feel poorly." These quiet winter days were not without challenges. The cold seeped through wattle walls despite their clay daub covering, and firewood needed careful rationing to last until spring. Food stores required constant monitoring for signs of vermin or rot. Still, there was a rhythmic peace to winter. Life, a turning inward that balanced the outward energy of growing seasons. By February's end, news reached them that the pestilence had begun to recede in some areas. Whether due to the cold weather or divine mercy, fewer new cases were reported. The village cautiously celebrated this development while maintaining their protective measures. Then came an unexpected challenge. Sir Geoffrey's steward arrived one bitter morning, stomping snow from his boots as he delivered his message. The Lord required additional taxes, payable immediately in grain or coin. The pestilence has affected his other estates severely, the steward explained to the gathered villagers, his breath fogging in the cold air. Several tenants have died, leaving fields untended and rents unpaid. Those villages, still healthy, must make up the difference. A murmur of discontent passed through the crowd. They had already paid their regular taxes after harvest. This additional demand would cut deeply into their carefully managed winter stores. Walter the miller stepped forward as spokesman. "We have always been loyal to Sir Geoffrey," he said carefully, "but this request comes at a difficult time. Our stores must last until spring planting. If we give more now, some families may face hunger before winter's end." The steward's expression hardened. "This is not a request. Sir Geoffrey requires 1 additional bushel of grain from each household to be delivered within 3 days." After the steward departed, the village council convened immediately in the church. Father Benedict listened as various members expressed their concerns. "We cannot refuse outright," Thomas said pragmatically. "That would bring harsher consequences. But a full bushel from each family," Agnes countered. "The widow Allen has barely that much left to see her through until spring." After much discussion, a solution emerged that embodied the community's strength. Those households with more abundant stores would contribute slightly more than a bushel, allowing those with less to contribute slightly less. Together they would meet Sir Geoffrey's demand without leaving any family to face starvation. Thomas and Peter the smith volunteered to deliver the collected grain to the manor house personally. They hoped for an opportunity to speak directly with Sir Geoffrey about the village's situation. Fortune favoured their endeavour. As they unloaded the sacks of grain under the steward's watchful eye, Lady Beatrice happened to pass through the courtyard. She recognised Thomas from a previous visit when he had delivered particularly fine arrows for her husband's hunting party. "You are the Fletcher from Whisperwillow," she said, pausing her walk. "How fares your village during these troubled times?" Thomas bowed respectfully. "By God's grace and our community's care, we have thus far been spared the pestilence, my lady. However, this additional tax weighs heavily on families already concerned about lasting until spring." Lady Beatrice's expression softened slightly. Though born to nobility, she had a reputation for practical compassion, unusual among her peers. "I will speak with my husband," she said quietly. "In the meantime, wait here." She returned shortly, with a small but heavy purse. "This contains coins to purchase grain, should your village's stores run too low before spring planting. Consider it payment in advance for arrows and other crafts. Whisperwillow will provide when safer times return." Thomas and Peter returned to the village with this unexpected boon, which was placed in the church's keeping for emergency use. The incident reinforced what the villagers already knew, that survival depended on both community solidarity and finding allies in unexpected places. As February gave way to March, the first tentative signs of spring appeared. Snowdrops pushing through melting drifts, slightly longer daylight, the return of certain birds. The village had survived not only winter, but also the threat of pestilence that had devastated other communities. On the spring equinox, Father Benedict led a special service of thanksgiving. The entire village crowded into the small church, voices raised in hymns that had sustained their ancestors through countless hardships. Afterward, Margaret addressed the gathered villagers. "We have been fortunate," she acknowledged, "but fortune favours the prepared and the united. Remember what has protected us: cleanliness, caution, herbal wisdom, and care for one another. These practices should continue even as danger recedes. The planting season began with renewed energy and hope. Fields that had lain dormant under winter's blanket were prepared for seeds. The Lord's lands were tended first, as required by custom. Then the villagers turned eagerly to their own strips of earth. Agnes and Eleanor transplanted herb seedlings they had nurtured indoors during winter's darkest days. Thomas repaired tools and prepared for increased arrow production, now that hunting season would soon resume. William proudly made his first completely independent arrow under his father's approving gaze. Little Matilda collected chicken eggs each morning, careful not to miss any hidden in unlikely nesting spots. Her delight at finding each speckled treasure brought smiles to her parents' faces, a reminder of life's simple pleasures that persisted even through difficult times. As April unfolded with warming days and frequent showers, news arrived that the pestilence had indeed receded throughout the region. Travel restrictions eased, and merchants once again brought their wares directly into the village centre, rather than leaving them at the boundary. One such trader brought information along with his goods. "They say the sickness passed by certain places entirely," he told the gathered villagers as they examined his cloth and spices. "Mostly remote villages like yours, but not all. Some say it was God's will. Others speak of protective herbs or special cleanliness." Margaret, listening nearby, exchanged knowing glances with Agnes. Their preparations had not been in vain. That evening, as the extended daylight allowed for a community gathering on the village green, Walter the miller raised a toast with freshly brewed ale. "To Whisper Willow," he proclaimed, "where we face hardship together and emerge stronger." Cups were raised in agreement, a moment of celebration before the hard work of planting continued. Later, as Thomas and Agnes walked home with their sleepy children, they paused to look at stars emerging in the deepening twilight. The same stars had watched over countless generations before them, through plagues and famines, through harsh lords and gentle ones. "We are small threads in a large tapestry," Agnes murmured, quoting her grandmother's favourite saying. Thomas nodded, understanding her meaning. "But strong threads," he added, "made stronger by how we're woven together." As spring progressed into summer, Whisper Willow continued its ancient rhythms, planting, tending, harvesting, preserving. The spectre of pestilence faded, though was not forgotten. Margaret ensured her healing knowledge spread more widely than before, teaching not just women, but also men and children old enough to understand. Sir Geoffrey, perhaps influenced by his wife or perhaps recognizing the value of a healthy, productive village, reduced the summer labor requirement by 1 day per month, a small concession that nonetheless improved the villagers' lives significantly. The Fletcher family, like others, in Whisper Willow, incorporated their newfound practices into daily life. They washed more frequently, maintained their herb garden with greater attention, and shared surplus food with neighbors when needed. These weren't dramatic changes, but subtle adjustments to traditional ways, the kind of adaptations that had allowed medieval peasants to survive for centuries despite overwhelming challenges. As summer's fullness brought abundance to their table once more, Thomas reflected on all they had weathered. "We have much to be grateful for," he told his family as they shared a meal of fresh bread and vegetable stew, enhanced by a rare piece of salted pork. "Our health, our home, our community." Eleanor, growing wise beyond her years, added thoughtfully, "and the knowledge that helps us prepare for whatever comes next." Agnes smiled at her daughter's insight. The girl was right. Perhaps the greatest asset they possessed wasn't physical goods or even good fortune, but the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced adversity before them and discovered ways to endure. William, ever practical like his father, summed it up best as he helped himself to another portion of stew. We survived because we remembered what mattered most, taking care of each other. As the stars emerged once more over Whisper Willow, the quiet strength of medieval peasant life continued, humble yet resilient, bound to the earth yet reaching toward heaven, living not in grand historical moments, but in the steady accumulation of days well lived in community. As this chapter closes its eyes, another tale begins to stir, of different hands working ancient soil, of wisdom whispered through generations, of survival woven from simplicity and shared burden. Listen now as sleep draws near, and another story emerges from history's gentle shadows. In the soft shadows of medieval times, where morning mist clung to ancient fields and stone cottages stood sentinel against time's passage, villagers wove invisible threads of community. Their calloused hands and weathered faces held stories of survival that transcended individual suffering, whispering secrets of collective endurance that the modern world has nearly forgotten. In a small village nestled between rolling hills and ancient woodlands, where the morning mist clung to thatched roofs like ghostly memories, life followed the steady rhythm of seasons. The village of Elmwood had stood for generations, its humble existence marked not by great historical events, but by the quiet persistence of its people. This forgotten corner of medieval England, with its cluster of timber-framed cottages and central green, had weathered storms both literal and figurative since before anyone could remember. The year was 1348, though few villagers tracked time with such precision. They measured their days by the position of the sun, their weeks by market days, and their years by the cycle of planting and harvest. The villagers of Elmwood worked the land that belonged to Lord William, whose manor house stood on a gentle rise overlooking their modest dwellings. It was early autumn now, the fields golden with ripening grain, the orchards heavy with fruit. The air carried the sweet scent of ripening apples and the earthier aroma of turning soil. Agnes, a widow of some 40 summers, rose before dawn as she had done every day since childhood. Her cottage, small but sturdy, had been built by her father and had sheltered 3 generations of her family. The packed earth floor was swept clean, the hearth at the center carefully banked from the previous night. Agnes moved through her morning tasks with practiced ease, stirring the embers to life and adding small twigs until flames flickered cheerfully in the gloom. Outside, the village was slowly awakening. Smoke rose from other cottages, and the soft lowing of cattle could be heard from the communal pens. Agnes paused in her doorway, breathing deeply of the cool morning air. Her eyes, still sharp despite her years, took in the familiar sight of her neighbours beginning their day. There was Walter the miller, already making his way to the small stone mill by the stream. Thomas the blacksmith was stoking his forge, and young Clara was leading the villagers' shared flock of sheep to the common grazing land. The rhythms of village life had always provided comfort to Agnes, even in the hardest times. And there had been hard times aplenty. Her husband had died 5 winters ago when fever swept through Elmwood, taking 7 souls to the churchyard. Her eldest son had been claimed by an earlier sickness when he was just a boy. Her daughter had married a cooper from a neighbouring village, and her youngest son, Edward, still shared her cottage, working their family strips in the common fields. Edward appeared from the small lean-to where they kept their tools. "The sky promises fair weather today," he said quietly, looking up at the paling blue above. We might finish the barley strip if the light holds. At 20 summers, Edward was considered a man grown, respected for his steady nature and strong back. Like most peasants, he wore simple homespun clothing, linen undergarments, woolen tunic and hose, all in undyed browns and greys that would not show the dirt of daily labour. Agnes nodded, tying her worn linen kerchief over her hair. Aye, and none too soon. There's a feel in the air that suggests rain before week's end. She had developed an uncanny sense for weather changes over her decades of working the land. This sensitivity was not mere superstition, but practical wisdom born of close observation. The way birds flew, how the leaves turned, the smell of the air itself. They broke their fast with a simple meal of dark bread and ale, supplemented with a small piece of hard cheese. Food was never abundant, but the villagers of Elmwood had learned to manage with what they had. The strips of land each family farmed in the open fields provided grain for bread, the village's lifeblood. Kitchen gardens yielded vegetables, and the surrounding woods offered forage, mushrooms, berries, nuts, and occasionally small game, though hunting in the Lord's forests carried severe penalties. As they finished their meal, there came a gentle knock at the door. It was Eleanor, the wife of the village reeve, carrying a small pot covered with a cloth. "Good morning to you both," she said warmly. "I've brought some honey from our new hives, the first harvest, and sweeter than any I've tasted." Agnes smiled and invited her in, clearing space at their small table. "You're kind to share such treasure. Eleanor, will you take some dried apples in trade? Last year's crop stored well." This was how the village sustained itself, not through coin, which was scarce, but through a constant flow of goods and services exchanged among neighbours. Eleanor's husband, as reeve, had responsibilities overseeing the village fields and settling minor disputes, but they worked the land like everyone else. No villager could survive alone. Interdependence was not a choice, but a necessity. "That would be most welcome," Eleanor replied. "And perhaps Edward might help Martin mend the fence around our garden? The deer have found their way in twice this week." Edward nodded his agreement before taking his leave, sickle in hand, to begin the day's work in the fields. Agnes watched him go with the quiet pride of a mother who has raised a son to understand responsibility and community. The morning progressed with the steady pace that defined village life. Agnes joined several other women at the communal baking oven, where they took turns placing their loaves in the hot cavity. While waiting, they shared news and concerns. "Have you heard word of sickness in the western villages?" asked Matilda, a gaunt woman whose life had been marked by hardship, even by the standards of Elmwood. Agnes felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Travellers' tales, perhaps. The peddler who came through last week mentioned nothing of it. "My cousin's husband travelled to Bristol for the wool fair," said Beatrice, the youngest of the group at just 19 summers. "He returned saying strange stories of a terrible disease that leaves black swellings on the skin. Many have died in the port towns, if his tales are true." The women fell silent, each remembering previous outbreaks of disease that had claimed loved ones. Sickness was a constant shadow over medieval life, striking without warning and often without explanation. The women of Elmwood had developed their own ways of responding to these threats. Herbal remedies passed down through generations, prayers to saints known for healing, and practical measures like isolating the ill when possible. "If such illness comes," Agnes said finally, "we will do as we have always done. We will care for our own, share what remedies we know, and place our faith in God's mercy." Her words carried the weight of experience. She had nursed many through illness. including her own husband in his final days. As the sun climbed higher, Father Thomas emerged from the small stone church that stood at the village centre. The priest was a kindly man, educated enough to read Latin texts, but wise enough to understand the practical concerns of his flock. He had come to Elmwood 10 years ago and had integrated himself into village life, even helping with harvests when extra hands were needed. "Good day to you, daughters," he greeted the women. "The bread smells heavenly, perhaps enough to tempt angels down from their celestial abode." His gentle humour was one of the reasons he was well loved in the village. "You'll have your share, Father," Agnes assured him, "though I suspect it's earthly hunger that brings you to the oven rather than theological curiosity about angels." Father Thomas laughed, but then his expression grew more serious. "I've had word from the bishop's messenger. The sickness they're calling the Great Mortality has indeed reached England's shores. Bristol has been hard hit, and it's moving inland." The women crossed themselves, murmuring prayers. It was one thing to hear rumours, another to have confirmation from the church itself. "What can we do, Father?" Beatrice asked, fear evident in her young voice. "Pray, of course," the priest replied, "but also prepare. Isolate any who show signs of illness. The bishop recommends burning herbs to purify the air, rosemary, sage, and wormwood if you have it. And," he hesitated, "when the time comes, we must be prepared to bury our dead quickly and with less ceremony than we would wish." Agnes felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She had lived through outbreaks of fever before, but something in the priest's voice suggested this was different, perhaps worse than anything they had faced. As the women dispersed with their baked bread, Agnes made her way to the edge of the village, where old Ida lived in a small cottage surrounded by herb gardens. Ida was Elmwood's healer, knowledgeable in plant lore and the treatment of common ailments. Though some villages viewed such women with suspicion, Elmwood had always respected Ida's skills, and even Father Thomas acknowledged her knowledge as a gift from God. Ida was working in her garden when Agnes approached, her gnarled hands carefully gathering seeds from dried plants. Though bent with age, her movements were precise, and her eyes were clear and alert. "You've heard, then," Ida said without preamble, sensing the reason for Agnes's visit. Father Thomas confirmed it. "The Great Mortality has reached Bristol." Ida nodded slowly. "I have been gathering what might help. Though in truth, from what I've heard of this sickness, our usual remedies may offer little protection." "What can we do?" Agnes asked, echoing Beatrice's earlier question. Ida straightened as much as her curved spine allowed. "We can strengthen those who are healthy with broths and tonics. We can try to keep the sickness from spreading by separating the ill. We can ease suffering with poppy syrup for those who are beyond saving." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes held compassion. "And we can remember that we have survived other sorrows, though not without loss." Agnes helped Ida gather herbs for the remainder of the morning, learning which combinations might offer the best protection. They spoke of practical matters, how to prepare the village for what might come, how to ensure food would remain available if many became ill at once, how to support those who might lose providers. When Agnes finally returned to her own cottage to prepare the midday meal, she found Edward already there, his face troubled. "Lord William's steward came to the fields," he explained. "The manor is making preparations for the sickness. They're gathering stores and limiting movement between villages, but the harvest must still be brought in, both our portion and the Lord's due." Agnes nodded as she stirred a pot of pottage, a thick soup of vegetables and grains that formed the basis of most meals. "The fields won't wait, sickness or no. The grain must be harvested, or we all starve come winter. This was the harsh reality of peasant life. The work of survival continued regardless of other hardships. Nature's cycles waited for no one, and the obligation to provide labor for the Lord's lands was binding. As they ate their simple meal, Agnes and Edward discussed their own preparations. Their cottage, like most in the village, consisted of a single room where they lived, cooked, ate, and slept. If one became ill, isolation would be nearly impossible. They might need to construct a simple shelter apart from the main building if the worst came to pass. After the meal, Agnes joined other women at the village stream where they washed clothing and linens. The gentle sound of flowing water and the rhythmic scrubbing created a meditative atmosphere where women had gathered for generations, sharing both the labor and the community it fostered. My grandmother told tales of the Great Famine 30 years past, said Maud, a woman close to Agnes. In age, she said nearly a third of the village perished, not just from hunger but from the desperation it brought. People eating what shouldn't be eaten, weakening themselves so that even minor ailments proved fatal. I remember it, though I was just a child, Agnes replied, wringing water from a linen shirt. It was the rains that did it, raining so long and so hard that the seeds rotted in the ground. 3 planting seasons lost, and yet the village survived, said Eleanor, who had joined them at the stream. Those who lived shared what little they had. That's how we've always endured. It was true. Medieval peasant life was characterized not just by hardship, but by extraordinary cooperation. The village operated as an extension of family, with each household both offering and receiving assistance as circumstances dictated. When one family lost their cottage to fire, all contributed to rebuilding it. When a mother died in childbirth, other women took turns nursing the infant. When age or infirmity prevented someone from working their land strips, neighbors ensured they were still worked and the elder still fed. This cooperation extended to their obligations to Lord William as well. Each family owed labor on his domain lands, but they worked collectively, turning obligation into community activity with shared songs and stories, making the burden lighter. As the afternoon waned, Agnes returned to the fields to help Edward complete the day's harvest. The barley field was nearly done, the golden grain falling before their sickles and being carefully bound into sheaves. Other villagers worked nearby on their own strips. The entire community engaged in the critical task of bringing in the harvest before weather could threaten it. Thomas the blacksmith appeared at the edge of the field, his day's work at the forge complete. Without a word, he picked up a spare sickle and joined the effort. This was common practice. Those whose primary work was a craft still participated in agricultural labor during critical times. In return, they would receive a share of grain or other goods from those they helped. As the sun began to lower in the western sky, casting long shadows across the open fields, William the Reeve called for the day's work to end. "Well done, all," he announced. 2 more days should see the barley complete if weather holds." The villagers gathered their tools and began the walk back to their cottages. Despite the looming threat of disease, there was satisfaction in the day's accomplishment. The harvest was progressing well, which meant bread for the winter, regardless of what other challenges might come. That evening, many gathered on the village green as darkness fell. Such gatherings were common in good weather, a time for community, after the day's labor was complete. Children played simple games with hoops and sticks, while adults sat together, mending tools or clothing as they talked. Walter the miller brought out a small pipe and began to play a gentle melody. Music was rare enough to be precious in village life, and conversations quieted as people listened. A few of the younger villagers began to dance, their movements adding visual rhythm to the piper's tune. Agnes watched from where she sat with other older women, her hands automatically continuing to spin wool into thread, even as her eyes followed the dancers. These moments of joy were essential counterpoints to life's hardships. The medieval peasant understood celebration not as frivolous escape, but as necessary spiritual and emotional nourishment. As the music continued, Father Thomas joined the gathering, sitting beside Agnes. "They dance as if there's no shadow on the horizon," he commented quietly. "Perhaps that's wisdom rather than ignorance," Agnes replied. "Joy must be gathered when it presents itself. Tomorrow has troubles enough of its own." The priest nodded thoughtfully. "There's profound theology in that observation, Agnes, more than in many scholarly texts I've read." As the evening deepened, people gradually returned to their homes. Agnes and Edward walked back to their cottage under a sky brilliant with stars. The night was clear and cool, promising frost by morning, another sign that winter approached and time for harvest grew short. Inside their cottage, they banked the fire for the night and prepared for sleep on their straw-filled mattresses, raised slightly off the earthen floor. A single candle provided the only light as they said their evening prayers, formal ones taught by the church and personal ones expressing their particular hopes and fears. "Do you think the sickness will reach Elmwood?" Edward asked as Agnes extinguished the candle. In the darkness, Agnes considered her answer carefully. "I think we must prepare as if it will, while praying that it won't. Either way, we face it together, not just you and I, but all of Elmwood." As the village settled into sleep, an owl called from the nearby woods, its haunting cry a reminder of the wild world that existed beyond human concerns. The medieval night wrapped around the cottages, deep and encompassing in an age before artificial light had diminished its power. Days passed in Elmwood with the steady rhythm that defined peasant life. The barley harvest was completed, and the community moved on to the wheat fields, always aware that time and weather were unpredictable allies at best. Lord William's steward came regularly to ensure the manor's portion was properly set aside, typically 1/3 of all that was harvested. News continued to arrive of the spreading sickness. A neighbouring village had reported its first cases, and travellers were now viewed with cautious suspicion rather than welcomed for their news and goods. Father Thomas held special services, leading prayers for divine protection. Ida prepared bundles of protective herbs for each household, and villagers hung them by their doors. It was 2 weeks after Agnes had first heard of the great mortality that the sickness finally reached Elmwood. Young Clara, who tended the sheep, returned one evening with an unusual fatigue and fever. By morning, she had developed the telltale swellings in her neck and groin, the buboes that gave the plague its name. Her family, guided by advice from Father Thomas and Ida, moved her to a small storage shed behind their cottage, converting it to a sick room. Her mother cared for her there, while her father and siblings remained in the main dwelling. It was a desperate attempt at containment, though few held much hope it would succeed. Clara died 3 days later. Her burial was hasty and attended only by her immediate family and the priest. The rest of the village maintained distance, watching from their doorways as the small procession made its way to the churchyard. "It begins," Edward said quietly as they returned inside after the burial party had passed. Agnes nodded, her face grave but composed. "We knew it would. Now we do what must be done." What followed was a time that would be etched in the memory of everyone who survived it. The plague moved through Elmwood with terrible efficiency, claiming victims seemingly at random. Young and old, strong and weak, none were guaranteed safety. Some households lost multiple members, while others remained untouched, a pattern that defied explanation in an age before microscopic organisms were understood. Despite the fear, the village did not collapse. Those who remained healthy continued to work the fields. The harvest could not wait, even for death. They also cared for the ill as best they could, leaving food and water outside homes where sickness had struck, taking in orphaned children, ensuring that livestock belonging to stricken families was tended. Agnes found herself working alongside Ida, moving from house to offer what comfort they could. They could not cure the plague, but they could ease suffering with herbal preparations that reduced fever and pain. They could provide clean linens and fresh water. Most importantly, they could ensure that no one died alone and abandoned. Lord William's manor was not spared. Word came that the Lord himself had fallen ill, along with his eldest son and several household servants. The steward, still healthy, relaxed some of the usual obligations, requiring only essential work on the domain lands while the crisis continued. When the plague finally began to wane some 6 weeks after Clara's death, Elmwood had lost nearly a quarter of its population. The survivors gathered in the church for a memorial service, the building fuller than it had been since the plague began, yet with conspicuous spaces where families and individuals once stood. Father Thomas, himself recovered from a mild case of the disease, spoke words of comfort and hope. "We have walked through the valley of death's shadow," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the small stone church. "We have lost those we loved, but we remain, and with God's grace, Elmwood remains. Now we must look forward to rebuilding what has been broken." The rebuilding began immediately, with practical matters taking precedence over grief. Fields belonging to families with no survivors were redistributed among those who could work them. Orphan children were formally taken in by relatives or neighbours. Widows and widowers formed new partnerships, some marrying quickly without the usual period of mourning, a practical response to the need for functioning households. Agnes and Edward had both survived, though Agnes had fallen ill and recovered, one of the few to do so. They took in Joel, a boy of 8 whose entire family had perished. It was an arrangement born of necessity, but quickly deepened into genuine attachment as Joel's quiet resilience and willingness to help endeared him to them both. As autumn deepened toward winter, the village faced new challenges. The harvest had been completed but was smaller than usual due to the loss of workers at critical times. Stores would be tight before spring brought new growth. Additionally, Lord William had died of the plague, and his second son, now the new lord, was an unknown quantity to the villagers. The first snow fell in early December, dusting the thatched roofs and bare fields with white. Agnes stood in her doorway, watching Joel and Edward repair their cottage's roof, adding fresh thatch before the weather worsened. The boy worked diligently, handing materials up to Edward, and clearly pleased to be trusted with the task. Eleanor joined Agnes, bringing a small pot of precious, honey-sweetened porridge as a gift. "The beehive survived when so much else did not," she commented. "Perhaps there's a lesson in that. The bees continued their work regardless of our human tragedies." Agnes nodded thoughtfully. "There's wisdom there. Life persists. The seasons turn. We plant and harvest, grieve and celebrate, and somehow continue." The two women watched their village in comfortable silence. Smoke rose from cottages where fires burned against the growing cold. Children who had survived the plague played in the light snow. From the forge came the rhythmic sound of Thomas's hammer as he worked to repair tools needed for winter woodcutting. The church bell rang for evening prayers, and people began moving toward the small stone building. Medieval life had never been easy. Before the plague, every year had brought its own challenges. Harsh winters, summer droughts, livestock diseases, raids from outlaws. The plague had been devastating, but it was, in some ways, merely an extreme version of the precariousness that always characterized peasant existence. What allowed villages like Elmwood to survive was not individual resilience alone, but the collective strength of community. No single peasant household could manage entirely on its own. It was the complex web of obligations, traditions, skills, and resources shared across the community that created sustainability even in the face of disaster. As winter settled over Elmwood, this community spirit manifested in new ways. Families with larger grain stores shared with those who had less. Hunting parties ventured into the woods, cautiously poaching rabbits and deer from the Lord's forests when necessary for survival. Preserved foods from autumn, smoked meats, dried fruits, fermented vegetables were exchanged based on need rather than strict equivalence. The new lord, William's son Robert, proved surprisingly understanding of the village's situation. Perhaps sobered by his father's death and his own unexpected elevation, he reduced some winter obligations and even opened manor storehouses to prevent starvation among his tenants. This was not pure charity. He understood that peasants who died of hunger could not work his fields come spring, but it was received with genuine gratitude nonetheless. Winter nights were long in medieval Europe, darkness falling early and lasting well into the morning hours. These nights were traditionally times of storytelling, handcrafts, and community gatherings to conserve precious fuel and lighting. Even after the plague's devastation, these traditions continued, providing comfort and continuity. Agnes hosted such gatherings in her cottage several times during that winter. Neighbors would bring their own work, spinning, whittling, mending, and share the warmth of a single fire. They spoke of those they had lost, not in tones of fresh grief, but with gentle remembrance, incorporating their departed loved ones into the village's collective memory. They also told older stories, folk tales and legends passed down through generations, histories of the village from times long past, even fragments of ancient knowledge that predated Christianity but had been woven into the fabric of rural tradition. These tales served not just as entertainment, but as vehicles for communal wisdom about survival, ethics, and the human relationship with the natural and supernatural worlds. Edward proved to have a gift for storytelling, his quiet voice growing, more confident as he recounted tales learned from his father. Joel listened wide-eyed, absorbing not just the stories, but the cultural heritage they represented, a heritage he would one day pass to his own children. As winter slowly gave way, to early spring, the village began preparing for the planting season. Seeds carefully preserved from the previous harvest were sorted and counted. Ploughs were repaired, fields assessed for drainage after winter snow and rain. The cycle was beginning again, as it had for countless generations. The first ploughing was, traditionally, a community event, with prayers for fertility and abundance. This year, it carried additional significance, a statement of continuity and hope after the plague's devastation. Father Thomas blessed the fields and the seeds that would be sown. The entire village gathered to watch as the first furrow was cut into the soil, exposing dark earth to the strengthening spring sun. Agnes stood with Joel beside her, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "This is how we always begin again," she told him softly. "The earth receives our work and our hope, and in time returns life to us." The boy nodded solemnly. In his short life, he had already learned much about both death and renewal. "Will the village ever be as it was before?" he asked. Agnes considered his question carefully. "No," she finally answered. "It will not be the same. Those we lost cannot be replaced. But Elmwood will continue. Different, perhaps, but still our home." As spring advanced, new life appeared throughout the village. Seeds sprouted in freshly turned fields. Livestock birthed new generations. 3. Women, including young Beatrice, were expecting children, new beginnings that offered hope for the future. The plague had left its mark, not just in the graves at the churchyard, but in how the survivors viewed their world. There was perhaps more appreciation for small joys, more awareness of life's fragility, more intentional kindness in daily interactions. These changes were subtle but significant, psychological adaptations that helped the community heal. Medieval. Peasant life continued its rhythm of seasons and obligations, hardships and simple pleasures. The people of Elmwood faced each day with the practical resilience that had allowed their ancestors to survive and would enable their descendants to do the same for generations to come. Agnes, watching the new green growth emerge in her small kitchen garden, reflected on this continuity. Her own life would eventually end, as all lives must. But the knowledge she had preserved and passed on, how to heal with herbs, how to read weather signs, how to preserve food for winter, would continue through Edward, through Joel, through all those she had taught. This was, perhaps, the most profound survival strategy of medieval peasants, the transmission of practical wisdom from one generation to the next. The village bell rang, calling people to the day's work in the fields. Agnes straightened, brushed soil from her hands, and prepared to join her neighbours. Behind her, Edward and Joel were already gathering tools for the day's planting. Before them lay the open fields where generations had laboured before and generations would labour after. This was how medieval peasants survived, not as isolated individuals, but as communities bound by shared labour, shared knowledge, and shared faith. Through plague, famine, and the demands of lords, they endured by turning to one another, adapting their practices when necessary, and never losing sight of the fundamental cycles that governed their world. In Elmwood and countless villages like it across medieval Europe, life continued, difficult and precarious, but also rich with meaning, connection, and moments of unexpected beauty. The resilience of these communities lay not in avoiding hardship, but in facing it together, drawing strength from bonds that connected each person to something larger and more enduring than individual experience. As the soft shadows of evening begin to cloak this tale of medieval endurance, let us drift with gentle purpose toward another story waiting in the wings. Like a pilgrim moving from one sacred site to another, our minds now journey onward, carrying the wisdom of Elmwood's resilient souls as we seek new histories to explore by night's tender light. Like whispers carried on autumn winds, the knowledge of generations flows through time, secrets of soil and sky, passed from weathered hands to young. In the gentle rhythm of seasons, medieval peasants wove their existence with patience and observation, their wisdom a quiet sanctuary against nature's whims. The mist hung thick over the fields of Welbury, a small medieval hamlet nestled between rolling hills and ancient woods. Dawn had barely brushed the eastern sky with her pale fingers, yet already movement stirred within the cluster of humble dwellings. Like shadows coming to life, figures emerged from thatched cottages, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Season's turning was upon them, summer fading into autumn's embrace, and with it came the whispered knowledge that had sustained these people through countless cycles of sun and moon. Agnes, an elderly woman whose face bore the gentle marks of 7 decades of life, stood in her doorway. Her eyes, still keen despite the years that had passed over them, surveyed the fields where barley swayed golden and ripe. She remembered when she had been a girl, no higher than her father's elbow, learning the rhythms of the land. Now, those same lessons would pass to her grandchildren, ensuring that the chain of knowledge remained unbroken through generations. Within the small village, time moved to a different measure than that of castle or town. Here, hours were counted by the position of the sun, days by the completion of necessary tasks, and months by the changing face of the land itself. The medieval peasant's calendar was not one of paper and ink, but of observation and experience. A living document written upon the very earth they tilled. Agnes watched as her son Thomas led his children. Emma, a girl of 10 with hair the colour of wheat, and William, a solemn boy of 8, toward the edge of the barley field. Today would be another lesson in the ancient art of reading the signs that nature provided, signs that had helped their ancestors survive through famine and abundance alike. "See how the berries hang heavy on the brambles?" Thomas said, his voice soft but carrying in the still morning air. He gestured to the wild thicket that bordered their small plot of land. "When they grow thick and plentiful like this, it means we must prepare for a harsh winter ahead. Nature provides bountifully before times of lack." Emma reached out a small hand to touch the dark, juicy fruits. "So we must gather them all?" she asked, understanding already forming in her young mind. "Yes," Thomas nodded, "and preserve them. The honey from the hives will be harvested soon, and with it, we shall make syrups and preserves to see us through the cold months. This is the way it has always been done." Agnes smiled at this exchange, remembering her own father teaching her the same lesson many decades before. Knowledge passed thus from hand to hand was more precious than gold to those who lived by the turning of seasons. While lords in their castles might rely on taxes and tribute, the common folk of Welbury relied on accumulated wisdom: how to read the sky, how to listen to the birds, how to understand the subtle language of growing things as the sun climbed higher, casting its gentle warmth over the village. The collective work of harvest preparation began in earnest. Women gathered with baskets woven from supple willow branches. Children carried small ceramic jugs of water and ale, and men sharpened their sickles with rhythmic strokes against whetstones worn smooth by generations of use. The village reeve, an elected position held this year by a stocky man named Edwin, moved among them, organising the day's labour, though all were subordinate to the lord whose land they worked. Among themselves existed a system of cooperation refined over centuries. Each family would help with the harvesting of the domain, the lord's portion, but they would also aid one another with their own modest strips of land, ensuring that no one's crop stood too long in the field where it might be ruined by sudden rain. Agnes made her way to where the other elder women had gathered near the communal baking oven, a sturdy structure of clay and stone that served the entire hamlet. Today, they would prepare food for the harvesters, but they would also begin the crucial task of seed selection for the following year's planting. "The rye has grown tall this season," observed Mildred, her gnarled fingers expertly sorting through a small pile of grain heads. "We must choose the heartiest seeds, those that grew despite the dry spell in early summer." Another woman, Edith, nodded in agreement. "And mind the barley that grew near the north field. It withstood the late frost better than any other." Such resilience must be preserved. This careful selection was part of an unwritten science that had developed over countless generations. Medieval peasants might not have understood the principles of genetics or selective breeding as modern farmers would, but they recognized that certain qualities in their crops were desirable and could be encouraged through careful seed saving. This knowledge, passed from mother to daughter and father to son, had slowly improved their yields over the long centuries, a quiet achievement of collective human ingenuity. Meanwhile, in a small clearing near the edge of the village, the herb woman, Winifred, instructed several young girls in the gathering and preparation of medicinal plants. This, too, was essential knowledge for survival through the changing seasons. The yarrow is at its most potent now, before the first frost touches its leaves, Winifred explained, her voice musical with age but still clear. Gather it carefully, leaving the roots undisturbed so that it will grow again next year. We dry it now to stop fevers in winter when fresh remedies cannot be found. The girls listened attentively, knowing that such knowledge might one day mean the difference between life and death for their families. Winifred showed them how to identify which plants were beneficial and which were harmful, how to harvest at the proper time, and how to prepare tinctures, poultices, and teas that would serve as the village's only medicine through the cold months ahead. And remember, she added, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief, St. John's wort must be gathered on Midsummer's Day to hold its power, but foxglove is gathered now, as summer wanes, when its strength is most concentrated. In this way, practical knowledge intertwined with folklore and religious observance, creating a tapestry of understanding that guided the peasants through each season. The church calendar provided structure to their year. Michaelmas, Christmas, Candlemas, Easter, Whitsuntide, Lammas, each feast day corresponding not just to religious observance, but to agricultural milestones and seasonal tasks. As midday approached, the work in the fields reached its peak intensity. Men swung their sickles in rhythmic arcs, women bound the cut grain into sheaves, and children gathered stray stalks that might otherwise be wasted. The Lord's steward, a thin man named Gilbert, who served as intermediary between the village and their absent lord, watched from horseback, ensuring that the domain harvest received proper attention. Thomas paused in his labour, straightening his back and wiping sweat from his brow. He glanced at the sky, noting the position of the sun and the gathering of small high clouds to the west. We should work quickly, he murmured to those near him. Rain comes by evening, I think. The others nodded, trusting his assessment. Thomas had an uncanny ability to predict weather changes, a skill honed through decades of outdoor labour and careful observation. Such natural forecasting was vital in a time before scientific meteorology, when a sudden downpour could ruin carefully harvested grain, or a flash frost could destroy vulnerable seedlings. By mid-afternoon, the workers broke for a simple meal, brought to the fields by the children too young to help with the harvest. Fresh bread baked in the communal oven, cheese made from the milk of the village's shared cattle, and ale brewed from last year's barley provided sustenance and momentary respite from labour. Agnes sat with her grandchildren beneath the shade of an ancient oak that marked the boundary between two fields. She broke her bread into pieces, sharing it among them as she pointed to various plants and animals nearby. See there, the swallows fly low today, she noted. That's another sign of rain approaching. And look how the sheep on the hillside have gathered close together rather than grazing widely. They know the weather will turn. William followed her gaze. How do the animals know, grandmother? Agnes smiled. God gives each creature the wisdom it needs to survive. The beasts feel changes in the air that we cannot. That is why we watch them closely. They speak to us in their own way. This combination of practical observation and spiritual understanding characterized much of medieval peasant knowledge. In an age before scientific explanation was available for natural phenomena, people made sense of their world through a combination of empirical observation and religious or folkloric interpretation. As the afternoon waned, the first harvested sheaves were brought to the threshing floor, a hard-packed earthen area near the center of the village. Here, over the coming days, grain would be separated from chaff through the laborious process of threshing and winnowing. But before this work began, the village priest, Father Benedict, arrived to bless the first fruits of the harvest. The entire community gathered, momentarily setting aside their tasks. They stood with heads bowed as Father Benedict sprinkled holy water over the golden sheaves and recited Latin prayers, asking for God's continued bounty and protection. To the medieval mind, spiritual and physical sustenance were inextricably linked. A good harvest depended as much on divine favor as on human effort. After the blessing, work resumed with renewed vigor. The gathering clouds that Thomas had observed earlier now grew more numerous, confirming his prediction of evening rain. The pace of harvesting quickened, with everyone understanding the unspoken urgency of securing as much grain as possible before the weather turned. In their small garden plot behind her cottage, Agnes worked alongside Emma, teaching her the art of gathering seeds from vegetables and herbs. This, too, was essential knowledge passed from generation to generation. Always choose seeds from the strongest plants, Agnes instructed, guiding Emma's hands as they carefully extracted seeds from a particularly robust carrot plant that had been allowed to flower. See how tall this one grew, how thick its stem. Its children will carry those same strengths. Emma nodded solemnly, treating each tiny seed with the reverence it deserved. Potential life, future nourishment, a small but vital link in the chain of survival that stretched backward into the distant past and forward into years yet to come. We will store these in clay pots, Agnes continued. Keep them dry and safe from mice and insects through winter. When spring returns, they will be our wealth. This focus on the cyclical nature of time, the certainty that winter would eventually yield to spring, that seeds preserved now would ensure food in the future, provided a framework of hope and purpose that helped medieval peasants endure through hardship. Their lives were precarious by modern standards, but they possessed a deep connection to natural rhythms and an understanding of their place within those patterns. As twilight approached, the first heavy raindrops began to fall, just as Thomas had predicted. The villagers hurried to cover the harvested grain with canvas cloths and to secure tools that might rust if left exposed to the elements. Children were dispatched to bring in laundry hanging on hedgerows and to ensure that livestock were properly sheltered. Inside Agnes's cottage, the family gathered around the central hearth. Thomas and his wife Martha prepared a simple supper of pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, herbs, and a small amount of salt pork, while the children helped Agnes sort the day's gathered herbs and seeds. The rain drummed steadily on the thatched roof, a comforting sound that signaled both the end of one day's work and the nourishment of the earth for future growth. By the light of tallow candles and the fire's glow, Agnes began the evening ritual of spinning wool, her fingers moving with practiced precision despite their age. "Tell us about the great hunger, grandmother," William requested, settling near. Her feet with a small piece of wood he was whittling into a toy animal. Agnes's hands paused momentarily in their work. The great hunger of 40 years past remained a somber memory for those who had lived through it. a time when 3 consecutive years of heavy rains had ruined crops across the land, leading to widespread famine. It was a difficult time. She began carefully, resuming her spinning. But it taught us much. We learned that acorns, properly prepared by soaking to remove their bitterness, could be ground into flour when grain was scarce. We discovered which wild plants could sustain us when gardens failed. Most importantly, we learned the value of community, that by sharing what little we had, more of us survived than would have otherwise. Thomas nodded from his place by the fire. That is why we maintain the common stores, he added, for the children's benefit. Each family contributes what they can during abundant years, so that all might have something during lean times. This system of mutual aid, developed organically over generations, represented another crucial survival strategy. Medieval peasants understood that no individual or family could hope to withstand all of nature's challenges alone. By creating informal systems of support and resource sharing, they increased their collective resilience. Outside, the rain continued to fall steadily, watering the newly exposed soil of harvested fields and nourishing the remaining crops. In villages throughout the medieval world, similar scenes played out. Families gathered in humble dwellings, sharing food, labor, and knowledge in ways that ensured their continued survival. As night deepened, Agnes told the children stories, not merely for entertainment, but as vehicles for important lessons. Tales of winters so harsh that wolves came into the village seeking food taught the importance of sturdy construction and vigilance. Recollections of floods that had swept away poorly placed cottages reinforced knowledge about safe building locations. Stories of successful harvests, despite drought conditions, preserved techniques for water conservation and soil protection. Through such oral tradition, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations remained alive and vital. Without books or formal education, medieval peasants nevertheless maintained a sophisticated understanding of their environment and the techniques needed to survive within it. Their knowledge was contextual and practical, refined through trial and error and the harsh winnowing of experience. As the evening grew late, the family prepared for sleep. Pallets stuffed with fresh straw were arranged around the still warm hearth. Before they settled, Thomas stepped outside briefly to check the weather one last time, an ingrained habit of vigilance that characterized peasant life. The rain lessens, he reported upon returning, shaking water from his cloak. Tomorrow will be clear for harvesting again. With this reassurance, the family said their evening prayers, simple expressions of gratitude for the day's sustenance and petitions for protection through the night. Then they lay down to rest, conserving energy for the labor that tomorrow would inevitably bring. In the quiet darkness, Agnes remained awake a while longer, her mind traveling backward through the years. She remembered her mother teaching her to predict winter's severity by observing the thickness of onion skins. She recalled her father showing her how to find wild honey by following the flight patterns of bees. Countless small lessons, seemingly insignificant in isolation, had together formed a comprehensive guide to survival that had served her throughout her long life. Now, in the autumn of her years, she found satisfaction in passing this knowledge to younger generations. The cycle would continue long after she was gone. Children learning from parents and grandparents, adding their own observations to the collective wisdom, adapting ancient techniques to meet new challenges. As autumn deepened into winter, the rhythm of work in Welbury shifted, but never ceased entirely. The harvested grain, now safely stored in elevated granaries, designed to protect it from moisture and rodents, was threshed and winnowed in carefully measured amounts. This process, beating the dried stalks to separate grain from chaff, then tossing the mixture into the air so that breeze would blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back to earth, was labor-intensive but essential. On a crisp morning when frost rimed the edges of fallen leaves, Thomas supervised the rotation of stored grain, a critical but often overlooked task in ensuring winter survival. "We must move each portion," he explained to William, who helped him shift grain from one storage container to another. "This prevents it from growing damp and spoiling in one place. It also allows us to check for signs of mice or weevils that might destroy our stores." This constant vigilance characterized medieval food preservation. Without modern refrigeration or preservatives, keeping food edible through winter months required numerous techniques developed over centuries. Smoking, salting, pickling, drying, fermenting. Each method had its specific applications and procedures, knowledge of which was essential to survival. In another corner of the village, women gathered in Edith's cottage, where the day's task was making cheese from the last abundant milk of the year. As winter approached, cattle produced less milk, making these final batches particularly precious. "Add the rennet carefully," Agnes instructed her granddaughter Emma, watching as the girl cautiously poured the enzyme-rich solution derived from a calf's stomach into the warmed milk. Too much, and the cheese grows bitter. Too little, and it fails to curdle properly. The women worked with quiet efficiency, their hands performing tasks that their mothers and grandmothers had done before them. The cheese they produced today would age slowly through the winter months, providing vital protein when fresh food grew scarce. Nothing was wasted in the process. Even the liquid whey separated from the curds would be used to feed pigs or incorporated into bread making. This waste-averse mindset permeated all aspects of medieval peasant life. Every resource was precious. Every material had multiple uses. Worn-out clothing was cut into strips for weaving rugs or stuffing mattresses. Broken tools were repurposed into new implements. Ash from cooking fires was collected for making soap or fertilizing gardens. This comprehensive recycling system, born of necessity, created a lifestyle that was remarkably sustainable by modern standards. As the short winter days grew even shorter, the village prepared for the coming feast of Christmas, a welcome break in the otherwise austere winter season. Though far simpler than modern celebrations, medieval Christmas observances provided crucial psychological sustenance during the darkest time of year. Agnes directed her grandchildren in the gathering of evergreen boughs, explaining the ancient symbolism behind the tradition. "The green reminds us that life continues even when the world seems barren," she said, her breath visible in the cold air. "We bring this reminder into our homes to give us hope through winter's darkness." Father Benedict, making his rounds through the village, stopped to observe their work. "The Christ child comes soon," he reminded them, his tone gentle. "We must prepare our homes and hearts." For medieval peasants, religious observance was not separate from daily life, but thoroughly integrated with practical concerns. The church calendar provided structure to the agricultural year, with saints' days marking appropriate times for planting, harvesting, and other essential tasks. Religious rituals offered psychological comfort in the face of hardship and uncertainty, while church teachings provided moral frameworks for community interaction. In the village hall, a simple structure but the largest building save for the small stone church, preparations were underway for the communal Christmas feast. Though humble by noble standards, this meal represented a significant allocation of preserved resources, justified by its importance for community cohesion and morale during the challenging winter season. Each family will contribute according to their means, Edwin the Reeve explained, as he made notes on a piece of precious parchment. Those with more give more, ensuring that all may partake equally in the celebration. This principle of proportional contribution and equal distribution during celebrations reinforced social bonds that were essential to village survival. The feast would provide not just physical nourishment, but also an opportunity for storytelling, music making, and the reinforcement of community identity, all crucial elements in maintaining the psychological resilience necessary to endure winter's hardships. As the Christmas season approached, Agnes spent evenings teaching Emma the art of making candles from carefully saved tallow and beeswax. Light was precious during winter's long darkness, both practically and symbolically. "We make extra candles for the holy days," Agnes explained, showing Emma how to dip wicks repeatedly into the melted fat. Light represents the Christ child coming into the world's darkness, but it also gives us the practical ability to work and gather after sundown, extending our productive hours. This blend of spiritual significance and practical utility characterized many aspects of medieval peasant life. Their worldview did not separate the sacred from the mundane. Rather, religious understanding provided meaning and context for daily activities, while practical concerns influenced religious observance. The winter solstice arrived with the year's shortest day and longest night. Though officially incorporated into Christian observance as Christmas, ancient awareness of this astronomical turning point remained embedded in peasant culture. Agnes, like many elder villagers, noted the position of the sunrise with quiet satisfaction. From masts this day forward, light returns to us by small measures, she observed to Thomas as they walked to early morning mass. Each day grows longer by the width of a rooster's stride, they say. Thomas nodded. And soon we must begin preparing seed trays near the south-facing windows, he added, his mind already turning towards spring planting, despite the snow that currently blanketed their world. This forward-looking perspective, the ability to plan and prepare for growing seasons, even in the depths of winter, was another survival trait cultivated by generations of agricultural experience. Medieval peasants lived not just in the present moment, but in a continuum that stretched backward through remembered experience and forward through anticipated needs. The Christmas feast, held in the village hall after special mass, brought the entire community together. Trestle tables lined the room, and for one rare day, food was abundant. The Lord Steward Gilbert attended, bringing a small portion of wine from the manor house to supplement the villagers' ale, a traditional gesture that acknowledged the interdependence of lord and peasants despite the significant power imbalance between them. As the feast concluded, village elders shared stories that connected present celebrants to their communal past. These tales of hardships overcome, of particularly bountiful harvests, of notable weather events or local legends, serve to reinforce shared identity and to transmit important historical knowledge to younger generations. Agnes, encouraged by her neighbours, told the story of how the village had survived the Great Hunger through cooperation and innovation. Though many present had heard the tale before, they listened attentively, understanding its relevance to their ongoing survival. Such narratives functioned not just as entertainment, but as practical guides to weathering future hardships. As winter progressed, the community maintained its cohesion through regular gatherings. In the evenings, rotating between cottages to save precious fuel and candles, villagers would assemble to perform necessary indoor tasks, mending tools, repairing harnesses, spinning wool, weaving cloth. These gatherings, called bees or sittings, combined productive work with social interaction, storytelling, and knowledge sharing. During one such gathering in Martha and Thomas's cottage, the conversation turned to signs of the approaching spring, still months away but already influencing planning. "The elder buds grow fat on the south-facing branches," observed John the miller. "My father always said that when elder buds swell before Candlemas, we should prepare for an early planting." Edwin the reeve nodded thoughtfully. "Yet the wild geese flew southward in tight formation last autumn, which often foretells a long winter. We must watch carefully in the coming weeks for more certain signs." This constant observation of natural indicators created a sophisticated seasonal forecasting system that helped peasants optimize their agricultural timing by aggregating multiple environmental signals: bird migrations, plant behaviors, insect activities, weather patterns. They could make relatively accurate predictions about seasonal transitions, giving them crucial advantages in planning their agricultural calendar. In Agnes's garden plot, now dormant beneath snow, specialized winter vegetables demonstrated another aspect of medieval adaptation. Kale, certain hardy cabbages, and parsnips remained viable even in freezing conditions, providing rare fresh nutrition during winter months. These cold-resistant crops represented generations of selective cultivation aimed specifically at extending the growing season into winter's domain. "We must check the parsnips after the next thaw," Agnes reminded Thomas. "They grow sweeter after frost touches them, but we should not leave them too long lest they begin to rot or animals find them." This intimate knowledge of each crop's particular requirements, when to harvest, how to store, how long various foods remained viable, constituted a complex body of knowledge essential to year-round sustenance. Such expertise was not written in books, but embedded in daily practice and oral tradition, passed from generation to generation through demonstration and shared labor. As February arrived, bringing slightly longer days though still deep winter conditions, preparations for spring began in earnest. In sheltered corners of cottages near south-facing windows, small trays of soil were prepared for starting certain crops indoors. "We plant the onions and leeks first," Agnes instructed Emma, showing her how to press tiny seeds into shallow troughs in the soil. "They need a long growing season and can withstand late frosts better than others." This careful succession planting, starting different crops at specific intervals based on their growing requirements, maximized the productivity of the short northern European growing season. It represented a sophisticated understanding of plant biology developed through centuries of observation and experimentation. On Candlemas Day, February 2nd, the village gathered in the small stone church for blessing of the candles that would provide light through the remainder of winter. After the ceremony, the elders met to discuss plans for spring planting, taking into account weather observations, seed availability, and the condition of tools and draft animals. "The manor steward informs me that we must increase the rye planting on the domain lands this year," Edwin announced to the assembled villagers. "This means we must adjust our own plantings accordingly." Such adaptations to manorial requirements represented another layer of complexity in peasant agricultural planning. Their own subsistence needs had to be balanced against labor obligations to the lord, requiring careful calculations about land use, labor allocation, and crop rotation. As the first signs of thaw appeared in March, icicles dripping from south-facing eaves, patches of bare earth emerging in sheltered spots, the village's activity level increased dramatically. Tools that had been repaired during winter evenings were brought out and given final inspections. Draft animals, somewhat thin after winter, but still healthy thanks to carefully rationed fodder, were gradually reaccustomed to work. Thomas supervised the inspection of ploughs, critically important implements that had to function perfectly for spring planting to proceed efficiently. Wooden parts that showed signs of wear were replaced. Metal components were checked for rust or damage and repaired by the village smith if necessary. "The share is still sharp enough," Thomas noted, running, his thumb carefully along the iron cutting edge that would slice into the earth. "But this moldboard may need replacing before next year." This preventative maintenance, performed when time allowed rather than when equipment failed, represented another aspect of the forward-thinking approach that characterized successful peasant communities. By anticipating needs and addressing potential problems before they became acute, they reduced the risk of catastrophic failure during critical agricultural periods. As the ground softened enough for digging, Agnes led her grandchildren into the forest that bordered the village lands. Here, they carefully harvested certain wild plants that appeared briefly in early spring before trees leafed out fully. "Ramsons," Agnes explained, pointing to broad green leaves that resembled lily of the valley but gave off a distinct garlic aroma when crushed. "They purify the blood after winter and strengthen the body for spring work. We gather them now, for they will disappear once the forest canopy thickens." This knowledge of wild foods and their seasonal availability provided crucial dietary supplements, especially during the hunger gap, the challenging period in late winter and early spring when stored foods ran low but new crops had not yet matured. Such foraging knowledge often made the difference between mere subsistence and actual nutrition during these difficult transitional weeks. With the arrival of true spring, the village exploded into coordinated activity. Fields were ploughed, seeds were sown, gardens were prepared, and livestock were transitioned to fresh grazing. The Lord's bailiff increased his presence, ensuring that domain lands received priority attention despite peasants' eagerness to work their own strips. Through all these seasonal transitions, from harvest abundance through winter scarcity to spring renewal, the medieval peasants of Welbury maintained their resilience through knowledge accumulated over generations. Their survival strategies encompassed not just practical techniques but social structures, psychological adaptations, and spiritual frameworks that together created a surprisingly stable way of life despite its inherent precariousness. In modern terms, we might describe their approach as holistic and systems-based, recognizing the interconnections between natural cycles, human needs, and community dynamics. They understood instinctively what contemporary sustainability science now confirms: that human flourishing depends on working with natural systems rather than against them, and that knowledge diversity and social cohesion are as important to resilience as material resources. As Agnes watched her grandchildren helping Thomas prepare seed beds one spring morning, she felt the reassuring continuity of this ancient way of life. The knowledge she had received from her parents now flowed through her to these young ones, just as the seasons themselves flowed one into another in endless cycle. "Remember," she told them, as they carefully measured the spacing between seeds, "the earth remembers how we treat her. Care for her gently, observe her closely, and she will sustain us through all seasons of shadow and light." Another chapter rises like a whisper on the wind, carrying tales of survival woven through generations past. Let us now drift gently into the next forgotten story, where ancient wisdom meets the quiet courage of everyday lives. Like threads of morning light through ancient trees, the wisdom of medieval artisans flows across centuries. Their fingers, calloused and knowing, preserved more than objects. They carried forward the heartbeat of generations, whispering secrets through the careful motion of hands that understood both creation and survival. In the small village of Willowvale, nestled between rolling hills that seemed to embrace the cluster of thatched roofs like protective arms, The morning mist carried the gentle aroma of dew-kissed wildflowers. The 13th century brought with it challenges that required patience, wisdom, and the quiet fortitude that characterized the peasant folk who called this secluded valley home. The river that meandered alongside the settlement provided not only sustenance, but also the soft, continuous melody that had lulled generations to sleep. A natural lullaby that complemented the rhythm of daily life. Agnes, a weaver whose fingers had memorized the patterns passed down by her grandmother, rose before the first hint of sunrise. Her cottage, humble though it was, contained treasures of knowledge in every corner. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, their essence infusing the air with medicinal scents. Various baskets filled with carefully collected wool occupied the space near her loom, a weathered wooden structure that had witnessed the creation of countless fabrics that clothed the villagers and occasionally made their way to the seasonal markets several miles away. Moving with unhurried purpose, Agnes kindled the hearth fire, coaxing the embers to life with practiced motions. The gentle crackling sound filled the small space, gradually warming the interior as dawn approached. Outside, roosters began their morning announcements, and the village slowly stirred to life. The medieval day always began this way, with fire, with sound, with the gradual transition from darkness to light. Time measured not by mechanical devices, but by the subtle shifts in nature's own timepiece. Agnes's daughter Elspeth joined her mother by the hearth, her eyes still carrying the softness of dreams. At 12 summers, she was already learning the complex patterns of weaving that would sustain her throughout life. Her fingers, not yet as nimble as her mother's, but eager in their learning, reached for the wooden comb used to card wool. Today would be another day of apprenticeship, another link in the unbroken chain of knowledge transfer that had defined their craft for centuries. The lords may command the land, Agnes often told her daughter in quiet moments like these, but our hands command the thread, and in that thread lives our freedom. This wisdom, spoken in hushed tones between mother and daughter, carried the essence of peasant survival through generations. The nobility might control fields and forests, but within the realm of craft and creation, peasant artisans maintained a sovereignty of skill that even the wealthiest lord could not claim. As morning light filtered through the small window, illuminating, dancing dust motes and golden beams, Agnes and Elspeth began their work. The rhythm of the loom created a meditative backdrop to their day, the shuttle passing through warp threads with a whispered swoosh, the beater compressing each new line of weft with a satisfying thump. These sounds, along with their breathing, and occasional soft instruction from mother to daughter, formed the music of creation that had remained essentially unchanged since Roman times. In the adjacent cottage, Edwin the potter was also beginning his day. His hands, stained with the permanent memory of clay, moved with deliberate gentleness as he prepared his workshop. For 7 generations, his family had transformed humble earth into vessels that carried water, preserved food, and graced even the simplest meals with quiet dignity. The knowledge of clay, where to dig for the finest quality, how to test its composition between thumb and forefinger, which woodland plants yielded the most vibrant glazes. This was the inheritance more precious than gold that had sustained his lineage through plague years and bountiful harvests alike. Edwin's apprentice, his nephew Thomas, arrived carrying a wooden bucket of fresh water from the stream. The boy moved with care, understanding that his uncle's arthritic hands made certain tasks increasingly difficult. This too was part of medieval craft preservation, the young providing strength where elders provided wisdom, creating a balance that ensured continuity. No formal documents recorded their arrangements, no contracts bound them. Only the invisible ties of family obligation and the shared understanding that knowledge must continue its journey forward. "See how the clay speaks to you," Edwin murmured as Thomas began to wedge the earth, removing air bubbles and creating uniformity in the material. "It remembers the riverbed. It carries stories from before our time. Listen with your hands, and it will tell you how it wishes to be shaped." These poetic instructions, delivered in the same unhurried cadence that Edwin had received from his own master, contained practical wisdom disguised as mysticism. The clay indeed had properties that communicated to experienced hands: its readiness, its temperament, its potential. Throughout Willowvale, similar scenes unfolded as the day brightened. Near the communal ovens, Marjorie the baker prepared dough with movements so familiar they resembled a dance rather than labor. Her fingers knew precisely how the texture should feel in different seasons: slightly moister in winter when the air was dry, somewhat firmer in humid summer months. This intuitive knowledge, impossible to record in writing in an age when literacy was rare among peasants, traveled through demonstration and repetition, through watching and doing. The village blacksmith, Hugh, had already been at work for an hour, his forge glowing orange in the early light. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil created a counterpoint to the softer sounds of the settlement. His craft, perhaps more than any other, blended practical necessity with something approaching artistry. The hinges he created for the village church door weren't merely functional. They featured delicate scrollwork that honored both the divine purpose of the building and the human hands that had raised it. Even in objects of everyday use, medieval, artisans found spaces for beauty, for the expression of something beyond mere survival. By mid-morning, the village square had come fully alive. Children scattered grain for chickens that pecked between cobblestones. Women gathered near the well, exchanging news and knowledge as they collected water for their households. Men repaired tools or worked in small gardens that supplemented the crops grown in the surrounding fields. The rhythms of their movements, the cadence of their speech, the ways in which they occupied space, all followed patterns established by countless generations before them. In this medieval world, preservation of culture happened not through museums or books, but through the living practice of daily life. When Elspeth learned to distinguish which plants yielded blue dye and which yellow, she was absorbing not just practical information, but an entire relationship with the natural world. When Thomas felt the centrifugal force of the potter's wheel beneath his hands for the first time, he was connecting with a lineage of makers that stretched back to ancient civilizations. These transmissions of knowledge happened wordlessly, often unconsciously, embedded in the mundane activities that filled each day from dawn until dusk. As the sun reached its zenith, casting shortened shadows across the village green, the daily routine shifted. Those who had been working since early morning paused to share a simple meal. Dark bread, perhaps some cheese, ale for adults, and watered cider for children. This midday respite provided more than physical nourishment. It was a moment when stories were shared, when the oral traditions that formed the backbone of peasant culture found voice. "My grandmother once told me," Agnes said to a small gathering near the well, "that during the great sickness that came before I was born, the village was saved by the knowledge of herbs that old Matilda possessed. She had learned from her mother which plants could cool a fever, which could ease a cough." As she spoke, Agnes's fingers continued their work, separating wool fibers with absent-minded expertise. The children listening absorbed not only the story itself, but the understanding that knowledge was power, that traditional wisdom had value equal to or greater than the pronouncements of distant authorities. Edwin added his own recollection, speaking slowly as his hands shaped a small clay cup without seeming to require his attention. And when the Lord demanded double tithe that year, despite the poor harvest, it was my father who knew how to make plates fine enough to sell at the market town. We survived because his hands remembered what his father had taught him. The unspoken message beneath these reminiscences was clear. In a world where peasants had little official power, their crafts provided a measure of security, a way to navigate hardship that couldn't be taken by force or decree. The afternoon brought a change in activities. Agnes and Elspeth moved their work outside to take advantage of the clear light. The loom remained indoors, but they brought their spindles, transforming cleaned wool into thread through the hypnotic motion of twist and pull, twist and pull. Other women joined them, creating an informal circle where hands remained busy while conversation flowed. Through these gatherings, patterns were shared, techniques refined, and innovations, subtle though they might be, introduced into the traditional practices. One elder woman, Bertha, whose eyes had grown too dim for close work but whose memory remained sharp as a new needle, often sat with these circles. Though her hands no longer created, her voice preserved countless patterns, recipes, and methods that might otherwise have been lost. For a green so bright it rivals spring leaves, she instructed a younger woman preparing dye. You must gather the woad when the morning dew still clings to its leaves, and never let the mixture grow too hot. These specific details, accumulated through generations of trial and error, ensured that even when individual practitioners passed on, their knowledge remained alive in the community. Not all transmission of craft occurred within family lines. Aldith, a young woman orphaned during a harsh winter several years prior, had shown such natural skill with embroidery that she had been informally adopted into the circle of textile workers. Though she shared no blood with any of her teachers, she received the same careful instruction, the same access to materials and techniques. Medieval peasant communities understood that knowledge was too valuable to restrict based on lineage alone. Talent needed nurturing wherever it appeared. As the afternoon waned, bringing longer shadows and cooler air, Edwin and Thomas removed their first batch of vessels from the kiln that had been firing since the previous day. The careful uncovering of each pot became a moment of community interest, with neighbours pausing in their tasks to admire the results. Success in craft was never purely individual in this world. It reflected on the village as a whole, adding to their collective resources of both practical objects and reputation. When a particularly fine jug emerged uncracked, with its glaze transformed into deep forest green, appreciative murmurs spread through the onlookers. That one will surely find a place in the steward's house, observed Hugh the blacksmith, recognizing quality that transcended the usual utilitarian standards. This too was part of craft preservation, the acknowledgement and celebration of exceptional work that inspired others to maintain high standards. Though no formal awards or ceremonies marked these achievements, the respect of one's peers served as powerful motivation to honor traditional methods while seeking the highest expression of them. As dusk approached, bringing with it the gradual transition from productive work to evening activities, the nature of cultural preservation shifted yet again. Gathered around hearth fires or seated on benches outside cottage doors, villagers engaged in the telling of tales that connected them to their ancestors and to each other. These stories ranged from practical accounts of particularly harsh winters overcome through specific techniques to the mystical legends that explained the world around them. Walter, whose advanced years had bent his back but sharpened his memory, often led these sessions. His voice, though weathered by time, carried surprising strength as he recounted the tale of how weaving came to their valley. "It was a woman named Ethel," he began, his audience already settling into attentive silence despite having heard the story countless times before. "She learned the craft from a mysterious traveler who some say was one of the fair folk in disguise. This traveler showed Ethel how threads could cross and embrace to create cloth stronger than thesum of its parts." Though modern ears might classify such stories as mere entertainment or superstition, for the medieval peasant they served essential functions. These narratives contained coded wisdom about techniques, about moral values, about the relationship between humans and their environment. When children heard how Ethel's patient attention to detail saved her village from cold during a legendary winter, they absorbed not just a pleasing tale, but a template for their own approach to craft and community. As true night fell, bringing with it a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch in the absence of artificial light, families retreated to their cottages. The final hours before sleep brought one more vital form of cultural preservation. The quiet time when parents might sing songs passed down through generations, or demonstrate fine details of craft that required the absolute concentration impossible during busy daylight hours. In Agnes's cottage, she showed Elspeth how to create a special twist in thread that would allow it to catch light in a particular way when woven. "My mother showed me this on a night much like this one," she said softly, her words forming a bridge across time, "and her mother before her. When you create this pattern, their hands guide yours, though they have long returned to the earth." This sense of connection with ancestors through the continuation of their practices gave meaning to work that might otherwise have seemed merely necessary for survival. In the darkness of Edwin's home, he guided Thomas's fingers over a completed bowl, teaching him to feel for imperfections invisible to the eye. "The touch tells what sight cannot," he murmured, his weathered hand covering the boy's smaller one. "This knowledge lives in your skin, not just your mind." This tactile wisdom, impossible to record in books, even had writing been common, could only pass from hand to hand, from generation to generation, through direct experience. Even in sleep, the preservation of culture continued in subtle ways. Children absorbed the rhythm of adult breathing, the familiar night sounds of their community, the sense of security that came from being part of an unbroken human chain stretching back through countless years. Their dreams were shaped by the stories they had heard, preparing their unconscious minds to receive and protect the knowledge that would sustain them throughout their lives. The village of Willowvale wasn't remarkable by medieval standards. Similar communities dotted the countryside throughout Europe, each developing their own slightly distinctive expressions of peasant craft and culture. What made their preservation methods effective wasn't their uniqueness, but rather their integration into every aspect of daily experience. Knowledge wasn't something separate from life. It was embedded in each action, each object, each relationship. When morning came again, as it had for centuries before and would for centuries after, the cycle resumed. Agnes and Elspeth returned to their loom. Edwin and Thomas prepared fresh clay. The daily rhythms continued, seemingly unchanging yet subtly evolving, as each generation added their own small innovations to the accumulated wisdom they had inherited. Beyond the individual crafts practiced in Willowvale lay broader cultural preservation methods that connected the village to the wider medieval world. Seasonal festivals marked the turning of the year, each bringing specific traditions that reinforced community bonds while transmitting important practical knowledge. The Spring Planting Festival, ostensibly a religious celebration, contained within its customs detailed information about appropriate timing for agricultural activities. The harvest celebration encoded generations of wisdom about food preservation and resource management for the coming winter. During these communal gatherings, craft knowledge that might normally be practiced within separate households became visible to all. Public demonstrations allowed children to observe masters outside their immediate family, exposed adults to techniques they might not otherwise encounter, and generally reinforced the value placed on skilled work. When Marjorie demonstrated the perfect consistency for bread dough during the harvest festival, or when Hugh created decorative ironwork before an audience at midsummer celebrations, they were simultaneously entertaining, teaching, and elevating these practices to something approaching sacred activity. The church itself, though representing an institution sometimes at odds with folk traditions, nevertheless served as another vessel for cultural preservation. The local priest, Father Thomas, had been born in the village before his education set him on an ecclesiastical path. He understood the importance of incorporating local craft traditions into religious observance, rather than suppressing them as pagan holdovers. The altar cloth, woven by Agnes and embroidered by several women including Aldith, featured patterns that had adorned sacred objects in the valley since before Christianity arrived. The communion chalice, though conforming to proper liturgical requirements, had been crafted by Edwin's grandfather with subtle decorative elements that echoed pre-Christian symbols important to the community. Through this syncretic approach, elements of culture that might otherwise have been lost found sanctuary within officially sanctioned religious practice. When villagers gathered for Mass, they weren't only participating in universal Christian rituals, they were also reaffirming their specific local identity through the physical objects that surrounded them, objects created by their own hands, or the hands of their ancestors. The changing seasons brought different aspects of cultural preservation to the foreground. Summer days, with their extended hours of light, allowed for intensive production and the teaching of techniques that required clear visibility. Winter evenings, long and dark, created space for storytelling and the transmission of oral history. Spring brought attention to crafts related to planting and fertility, while autumn focused community energy on preservation techniques for food and resources. Throughout the year, the exchange of knowledge extended beyond the village itself. Though medieval peasants are often portrayed as isolated and static, in reality there existed networks of communication and trade that brought new ideas even to small communities like Willowvale. The seasonal markets held in larger towns provided opportunities not just for selling surplus craft items, but also for encountering different techniques and materials. When Agnes travelled to the autumn market in the nearby town, she returned not only with thread and dyes she couldn't produce herself, but also with stories of weavers from other regions, perhaps even glimpses of patterns from distant places that she might incorporate into her own work. Edwin might discover a new glazing technique from a potter who had apprenticed in a monastery workshop. These innovations weren't adopted wholesale or without consideration. They were carefully evaluated, adapted to local materials and needs, and gradually incorporated into existing traditions when they proved beneficial. The relationship between peasant craft and lordly demand created another complex dynamic in cultural preservation. When the lady of the manor requested particularly fine linen with specific decorative elements, Agnes might need to revive techniques that hadn't been commonly used for a generation. The resulting work, though created under obligation rather than free choice, nevertheless kept alive methods that might otherwise have faded from memory. Similarly, special commissions for the church or for celebrations at the manor house often called for the highest expressions of traditional craft, pushing artisans to maintain and develop the most sophisticated aspects of their cultural inheritance. Not all aspects of medieval peasant culture were preserved with equal success. Certain techniques or patterns might disappear for generations when the circumstances that made them necessary or desirable changed. A particular method for weatherproofing cloth might be forgotten during decades of milder climate, or a decorative tradition might fade when the symbolic system it referenced lost meaning for younger generations. Yet the underlying approach to craft, the patience, the attention to material, the integration of beauty and function, these foundational elements remained remarkably stable through centuries of otherwise dramatic change. The physical objects created through peasant craft served as another form of cultural preservation, more durable in some ways than oral tradition alone. Though individual items, a wooden spoon, a clay pot, a woven blanket, might not survive for centuries, their continuous production created a material record of aesthetic and practical choices that defined a community. When Elspeth eventually taught her own daughter to weave patterns that Agnes had taught her, the physical continuity of design across generations made the connection to ancestors tangible rather than merely conceptual. As evening approached again, in Willowvale, the village, priest rang the church bell, signaling the transition to night prayer and rest. The sound carried across fields and through the cluster of cottages, drawing some villagers to the small stone church, while reminding others to offer prayers where they stood. This auditory tradition, like so many elements of medieval life, served multiple functions simultaneously: religious observance, timekeeping, community cohesion, and the maintenance of shared identity through repeated ritual. Inside the church, candlelight illuminated the space where generations had gathered before and generations would gather after. The wooden pews, carved by local hands decades earlier, bore the subtle impressions of countless bodies. The stone font, though conforming to diocesan requirements in its basic form, featured decorative elements particular to this valley, executed by a stonemason whose grandfather had helped build the original structure. Even in this most institutional of spaces, local craft and cultural expression found ways to persist and evolve. After the brief evening service, villagers dispersed to their homes for the final activities of the day. In many cottages, this time was devoted to mending, the repair of tools, clothing, and household items that sustained family resources through careful attention rather than replacement. Children watched as parents darned socks with patterns of stitches more elaborate than strictly necessary for function alone, absorbing the understanding that even utilitarian tasks could contain elements of beauty and personal expression. Innow, Agnes's home, as she showed Elspeth how to repair a small tear in a treasured wall hanging, she shared the history of the object itself. "Your great-grandmother created this to commemorate the birth of twins in our family, the only twins to survive in 5 generations. See how she used these doubled motifs throughout? This wasn't just decoration, it was remembrance." Through such casual instruction, family history intertwined with craft knowledge, each reinforcing the value of the other. As night deepened and the village grew quiet, the day's work of cultural preservation came to a close, only to begin again with the next dawn. This continuous cycle, repeated across years and decades and centuries, created a resilience in peasant traditions that allowed them to absorb changes, political shifts, climate variations, technological innovations, without losing their essential character. What made medieval peasant culture endure wasn't rigid adherence to unchanging practices, but rather a paradoxical combination of deep conservatism and practical adaptability. Core techniques might remain stable for generations, while their specific applications evolved to meet changing circumstances. The fundamental values embedded in craft traditions, resourcefulness, attention to material properties, balance of utility and beauty, provided a framework flexible enough to accommodate necessary changes while maintaining cultural continuity. As candles were extinguished and fires banked for the night, the physical darkness was counterbalanced by the illumination of memory and tradition that would carry forward into yet another day. The hands that had created beauty and necessity throughout the daylight hours now rested, but the knowledge they contained remained alive, not preserved in amber, but sustained in the dynamic, breathing reality of a community that understood its past as a resource for present survival and future thriving. In this way, through the quiet persistence of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of creation and transmission, medieval peasant culture maintained its essential character. Through plague years and times of plenty, through the reigns of harsh lords and beneficent ones, through wars and periods of peace, the legacy of these nameless craftspeople, the Agneses and Edwins of countless villages like Willowvale, continues to echo in objects preserved in museums, in techniques still practiced by modern artisans, and in the fundamental human understanding that knowledge passed from hand to hand carries something more valuable than mere information. As the stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of a night, like countless nights before, the village slept beneath the protective mantle of shared tradition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities for the preservation and evolution of their cultural inheritance. The hands that had worked today would work again, adding another small layer to the accumulated wisdom of generations, another thread in the unbroken tapestry of human creativity and resilience. The knowledge and arts of the medieval peasants, those quiet cultivators of beauty amidst hardship, did not disappear with the closing of their era. Though castles crumbled and kingdoms fell, though plagues ravaged and wars redrew boundaries, the essential wisdom of the hands continued its journey forward through time. Even now, when we admire the perfect balance of a hand-thrown pot, or marvel at the intricate pattern of a woven textile, we are connecting with those distant ancestors whose names may be forgotten, but whose legacy lives on in the continued human impulse to create with care, patience, and reverence for material and tradition. A soft thank you to you, the listener, for journeying with us through these gentle tales of forgotten wisdom. If you're new here, we'd love to have you subscribe so you never miss these quiet escapes into history's embrace. May the ancient rhythms of craft and creation follow you into your dreams, and may you awaken renewed by these whispered stories from long ago.